I want to tell you about the day I almost reported a theft, and then didn't, and how that choice, that one split-second decision to lower my hand and keep my mouth shut, ended up changing the way I think about what it means to be human. Not the biological definition, not the genetic one. I mean the other kind. The kind that doesn't have a word in any language I know, but you recognize it the moment you see it. The kind that makes you stand still in the middle of a crowded transit station with noise and light and alien chatter all around you and just breathe. I've been stationed at Velaryon Station for going on 3 years now. Cargo relay post, technically. Transfer hub between the Inner Rim and the Keth Corridor. If you've never heard of it, that's fine, most humans haven't. It's not the kind of place that makes it into the travel feeds or the exploration logs. It's the kind of place where things pass through. Goods, people, beings of a dozen different species just trying to get from one point to another. Nobody lingers at Velaryon if they can help it. But I lingered. I work there. And what I saw that morning in Section 7, in the food market corridor between docking rings 4 and 5, I've never forgotten it. I don't think I ever will. Velaryon Station isn't pretty. I should say that up front because I know some of you might be picturing one of those gleaming galactic hubs you see in the official feeds. All clean white panels and smooth transit lines, and those little floating garden spheres the Velhari like to install in public spaces. That's not Velaryon. Velaryon is old. The kind of old that shows in the walls, in the uneven patches where different construction crews from different eras tried to seal the same duct leaks. The lighting in some sections still flickers. The environmental systems in the lower docking rings run about 4 degrees colder than they're supposed to, and everybody who works there has just accepted that and moved on. The station was built about 80 years ago, before my time, obviously, back when the Keth Corridor was first being mapped and the Galactic Assembly was still figuring out where to put relay posts. It changed hands a few times, was a mining coordination hub for a while, then a refugee processing center during the Marin displacement, then a proper transit station. Layers of history in every corridor if you know where to look. The food market in Section 7 is one of the oldest parts of the station. It started as an informal thing, traders and travelers setting up along the corridor between the docking rings because that's where the foot traffic was. Over the decades, it became a fixture. Now it's maybe 300 meters of stalls and vendors of every kind, selling everything from processed ration packs to fresh-grown produce from the hydroponics bay in the upper section to things I genuinely cannot identify, but which smell incredible at 7 in the morning when you're walking to your shift. I pass through it every day. My route from crew quarters to my post at cargo management takes me right down the middle of it. I've walked that corridor so many times I could do it blind. It was a Tuesday morning by station reckoning. Early. The market was just starting to fill up, vendors unlocking their stalls, pulling back covers, firing up heat lamps for the produce displays. The Velhari flower vendor 2 stalls from the east entrance was arranging those big violet blooms she always has, the ones that look like they're made of glass. A Keth food stall owner was calibrating his cooking platform, that low hum it makes when it's warming up. A couple of Drayan transit workers were eating something wrapped in dark leaf at a standing table near the center of the corridor. Normal, ordinary, just another morning. I had a cup of station coffee, which is honestly terrible, but it's hot and it's caffeine, and those are the 2 qualities I care about at 7 a.m. And I was walking slowly, not rushing for once, because I'd started my shift early the day before and I'd earned a few extra minutes. That's when I saw her. She was standing near one of the human food stalls. Korvath's stall, if you know it, Sergei Korvath, a Russian-Ukrainian guy who'd been running a bread and pastry stall in Section 7 for about 6 years. Makes his own bread. Old Earth recipes, he always says, though I'm pretty sure he's made up at least a few of them. But the bread is real. Dense, dark, fragrant. He has these small loaves he sells wrapped in paper, and the smell of them in the morning is the best thing about walking through Section 7. She was standing maybe 2 meters from his stall. And she wasn't human. I should describe her, because the description matters. She was Marin. That's the species Marin from the Marin system, the ones displaced about 40 years ago when their homeworld's primary resource veins were claimed under the old assembly extraction treaties. You've probably seen Marins if you've spent any time on stations. They're hard to miss. Tall, this one was about 2 meters, maybe a little more. Long-limbed. Their skin has a quality I can only describe as translucent in places, like you're seeing something underneath it, though that's probably not accurate. Their eyes are large, set wide, golden amber color in most adults. Their clothing tends to be layered. They run cold by human standards, and most station environments are a few degrees below their comfort range. Her clothing was worn. Not dirty, but worn, the kind of worn that tells you it's been washed many times in limited water and it's holding together through sheer stubbornness. She was wearing a long outer garment in a faded gray-green, belted at the waist, sleeves too long for her arms so that they covered her hands when she let them hang. Under one arm, held close to her chest, was a child. That's the word that came to mind immediately, child. Even though it was a Marin child, even though the proportions were different, the posture of holding it was unmistakable. The way you hold something small and alive that you are responsible for, that you are protecting. The child was very young, maybe a year or two in Marin reckoning, which I don't actually know the conversion rate for, but it was small, much smaller than her. It had its face turned into her shoulder. The child was making a very small sound, not crying exactly, more like the sound before crying, the sound when something is on the edge. The woman, the mother, was looking at Korvath's bread display. Just looking. She wasn't moving, wasn't reaching, wasn't doing anything except standing there with her child held against her chest and her golden amber eyes fixed on the loaves of bread in the display case. I noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't fit the usual pattern of a place. She wasn't shopping. She wasn't waiting for someone. She was just standing there, very still, in a way that had a particular quality to it. I slowed down. I didn't stop, but I slowed. Korvath was busy at that hour. Early morning is his rush, workers heading to shift, travelers getting food before their connections, the general flow of a station waking up. He had a line of about 6 or 7 people, a Drayan woman buying a small loaf, a human guy I didn't recognize, probably a traveler, pointing at something in the display. Korvath himself behind the counter, talking, gesturing, wrapping things in paper with the quick, efficient movements of someone who has done this 10,000 times. The Marin mother moved. It was very fast, very small. She stepped closer to the display case, the side of it, where the counter curved away from the main serving area. Her free hand came out from her sleeve. She reached. Her fingers touched one of the small loaves, the dark rye ones, the smallest size, barely bigger than a fist, and she took it. She put it immediately inside her outer garment, against the same side where she was holding the child. And she stepped back. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds. I saw it. I was the only one who did, as far as I could tell. Korvath was talking to his customer. The line of people were looking at their own things. The other vendors nearby weren't looking her way. Just me. I stood there with my terrible station coffee, and I looked at this woman who had just stolen a small loaf of bread while holding her hungry child, and I thought about what to do. Here's the thing about Valarian station security. It's not brutal, but it's thorough. The Galactic Assembly's Transit Authority has jurisdiction here, which means the enforcement officers are gas standard, a mix of species, reasonably well trained, carrying the authority of the Assembly rather than any particular planetary government. Theft on a transit station is treated seriously because a lot of the merchants here operate on small margins. Korvath, for instance, His stall is his livelihood. He doesn't have a corporation behind him. He's one guy with a bread oven and 6 years of early mornings. The penalty for theft for a non-citizen, and Marins who are still in the displacement system don't carry full assembly citizenship, is detention and deportation back to whatever processing station they came from, which sounds administrative and clean. It's not. The processing stations for displaced Marins are not good places. I'd seen some reporting on them. Overcrowded, under-resourced. The kind of place where you lose months or years to bureaucratic limbo. If I reported what I'd seen, this woman would be detained. Her child would be taken to the station's species-appropriate care facility while she was processed. And then she'd go back into the system she'd clearly been trying to navigate or escape. For one small loaf of bread that I could buy myself for 3 station credits. I lowered my hand. I hadn't even raised it to signal anyone, but I lowered it anyway, just to complete the thought. I kept walking. But I didn't walk past her, I walked toward her. She saw me coming, and the change in her was immediate and total. She went rigid. Her arm tightened around her child. Her eyes tracked me with the particular alertness of someone who has learned that being noticed is dangerous. Her free hand pressed flat against her outer garment where the bread was, not reaching for it, just pressing, like she could somehow make it less real. I stopped about 1.5 meters away. I want to be honest here, I didn't have a plan. I hadn't thought this through. I just knew I didn't want her to run, because if she ran she'd be even more conspicuous, and I didn't want the child to be jostled around more than necessary, and I just didn't want to be the person who reported her. That's all I had. I said, "Hey." Not brilliant, but it was what came out. She didn't respond. Her amber eyes were fixed on me with an expression that was, I don't have a better word for it, waiting. She was waiting for whatever came next. Like she'd been in this position before, metaphorically speaking, and she'd learned that what you do is go still and wait and see what the other person does. I said, "I'm not going to say anything." She still didn't respond. I didn't know if she spoke standard. Most Marins in the displacement system do. It's a practical survival thing, but not all. I tried again, slower. I'm not going to tell anyone. Something in her face shifted, just slightly. The kind of shift that's less an expression and more a recalibration, like she was processing what I'd said against everything she expected. The child made a sound, that small pre-crying sound again. And then something happened that I still think about. The woman, this Marin mother who had just stolen bread and been caught, and was braced for whatever consequence came next, looked down at her child for just a moment. And the expression on her face when she looked at her child was not fear or calculation or anything complicated. It was just love. That specific, helpless, enormous love that parents have for small children. The kind that doesn't belong to any one species. The kind that just is. She looked back up at me. "I will pay," she said. Her standard was careful, accented, but clear. "When I will pay." I don't know what made me do what I did next. I turned and I walked to Korvath's stall. The line had thinned out a little. Korvath was wrapping something for the last customer, that quick paper folding thing he does. I waited until he was done, and then I stepped up. "Sergey," I said. He looked up. We knew each other the way you know people you see every morning, not close friends, but a comfortable familiarity. He was a big guy, Korvath. Wide shoulders, salt and pepper beard, the kind of hands that look like they were designed specifically for kneading dough. He had a kind face when it was relaxed. A little guarded right now, the way vendors get when they're in the middle of a rush. "The Marin woman," I said quietly, "standing near the end of your counter." His eyes went immediately in that direction. I watched his face go through the sequence, recognition, then the kind of tightening that happens when you realize something was taken, then something more complicated. He looked at me. I said, "She has a young child." I'd like to pay for whatever she took and also get her a couple more of the small loaves, and whatever you think a child that age might need." Corveth was quiet for a moment. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. He had every right to be angry. He had every right to call security. He had every right to tell me this wasn't my business and that theft was theft regardless of the circumstances. He looked at the woman again, at the child. He looked at me. He said, "You know what? I noticed something missing from my display about 10 minutes ago, and I already adjusted my inventory count." He said it evenly, looking me in the eye. "So technically, there's nothing to pay for." Then he turned and reached under his counter and came back up with a bag, a proper bag, the kind he uses for big orders, not the small paper wrapping. He started filling it. He put in 4 small loaves of dark rye, the same kind she'd taken. He put in 2 of the large rolls, the soft ones. He reached to the side where he kept his personal stock, the things he ate himself during his shift, and he took out a jar of something dark and sweet, a Marin food item I later found out is called Welsh, a kind of nutrient-dense paste that Marin children eat early in their development. I have no idea where Corveth got it or why he had it, but he had it. He put that in the bag too. He folded the top of the bag over and held it out to me. "No charge," he said. I took it. I went back to where the woman was standing. She hadn't moved. She was watching everything with those wide amber eyes, very still. I held out the bag. "From the vendor," I said. "No debt, no record." She looked at the bag. She looked at me. For a moment I thought she wasn't going to take it. Pride is a real thing, a real and complicated thing, and I didn't want to be doing this wrong. But then the child made that sound again and she took the bag. She held it against her with the arm that wasn't holding the child and she looked at me, and her expression was doing something I couldn't fully parse. Marin facial expressions are different from human ones, not unreadable exactly, but you have to learn the vocabulary, and I didn't fully have it. But her eyes were doing something I understood completely. She said quietly in that careful standard, "Why?" Not a question exactly, more like something she needed to say out loud. I said, "Because you're hungry and your kid is hungry." She was quiet. "And because it's morning," I said, which didn't make any logical sense, but it was true in some way I couldn't explain. The light in Section 7 in the mornings, even the artificial station light, has a particular quality. Something about it makes ordinary things feel more important than they are. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Thank you." 2 words, but the way she said them, slow, deliberate, like she meant every syllable and wanted to make sure they landed right, I felt them. I was going to leave it there. I want to be honest about that. I'd done what felt right. Corveth had done more than I expected, and I was already going to be a few minutes late to my shift. I was planning to wish her well and move on. But then the assembly enforcement officers appeared. 2 of them, coming from the east entrance of the market corridor, walking with the particular kind of purposeful casualness that enforcement people have when they're responding to something but trying not to cause a stir. One was human, a woman, stocky, dark uniform, hand not on her sidearm but close to it. The other was Velhari, the tall, reed-thin kind, with those silver-gray eyes they have. Someone had called them. I found out later it was a vendor 3 stalls down, a merchant I didn't know well, Dreth species, who had apparently seen the theft and reported it before I'd even gotten involved. Which means the whole sequence of me deciding not to report it, walking over, talking to her, going to Corveth, all of that had been happening while a response was already on its way. The officers had clearly gotten a description. They were looking at the Marin woman directly. Everything went very fast. The human officer was already reaching for her credentials display, the thing they hold up when they're about to detain someone. The Velhari was angling around to the other side, cutting off the corridor. The woman saw them. Her body language changed completely, that same rigid freeze but more extreme this time, and the child must have felt it because the child made a sound, a real cry this time, not the almost crying from before. And I stepped in front of the officers. I don't know why I'm calling it a step, it was more of a placement. I just moved so that I was between them and her, not blocking them aggressively, just there. The human officer stopped. She looked at me with the expression enforcement people get when someone does something unexpected that they don't immediately know how to categorize. "Sir," she said. "I know what you're responding to," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "I'm crew here, Marcus Veller, Cargo Management, badge number 7742. I want to give you some context before you proceed." She looked at my badge, looked at my face. "The vendor in question has already resolved the situation," I said. "Corvath, the bread stall, 4 units down. He's confirmed to me directly that there's no open report, no inventory discrepancy, and no complaint from his end. The incident is resolved from the victim's perspective." The officer was quiet for a moment. "Someone else reported it," the Velhari officer said, the first time he'd spoken. "I understand that," I said, "and I understand your procedures. I'm not trying to interfere, I'm giving you context." The human officer looked past me at the Marin woman, at the child. Something happened on her face, something small and quick and then gone, tucked back behind the professional composure. She looked at her partner. He looked at her. There was a pause that probably lasted about 4 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then the human officer took a slow breath. "We'll need to confirm with the vendor," she said. "Of course," I said. "I'll walk over with you." Corvath was magnificent. I mean that without any irony. The man was magnificent. When the officers approached his stall, he was already looking at them. He'd seen the whole thing from behind his counter, I realized. He'd been watching it all. The human officer introduced herself, explained the report, asked him to confirm whether a theft had occurred. Corvath looked at her with the calm authority of someone who has run a stall in Section 7 for 6 years and has dealt with more complicated situations than this. "About 40 minutes ago I reorganized my display," he said. "I had some items I put aside for a standing order that came in early. If anyone saw something that looked like product moving, that would be what they saw. My count is correct. I have no complaint to make." He was lying. He was lying smoothly, without hesitation, with the particular confidence of a man who has decided something and is completely comfortable with his decision. The human officer looked at him for a long moment. "The report indicated." "I can show you my inventory log," Corvath said, and he was already reaching for his display tablet. "Current count, confirmed this morning. You're welcome to match it against any baseline you have." I don't know if the officers had a baseline inventory to compare. Probably not. That level of detail isn't typically on file for individual vendor stalls. The Velhari officer looked at the human officer again. She looked at Corvath. She looked back toward where the Marin woman was standing. And then she did something I didn't expect. She bought a loaf of bread. She reached into her uniform pocket, put down payment, and bought one of the small dark rye loaves. Corvath wrapped it without comment. She tucked it under her arm. "Thank you for your time," she said to Corvath. She looked at me. "Thank you for the context, Mr. Veller." She and her partner turned and walked back the way they'd come. The whole Section 7 market had been watching. Vendors, customers, passers-by. Nobody quite pretending they weren't watching, but nobody staring directly either. That particular station, culture of observant privacy that develops in places where people of many species and many situations learn to coexist in tight spaces. The moment the officers turned the corner, the normal sounds of the market came back. Vendors returning to their work. Customers continuing their orders. The Velhari flower vendor by the east entrance, who had been holding very still during the whole thing, went back to arranging her glass violet blooms. I turned back to the Marin woman. She was standing in the same spot, holding her child and the bag of bread with the same stillness as before, but something had changed. She was looking at me differently. Not with the careful, waiting look from before, with something that had more weight to it. Her child had stopped crying. I don't know exactly when that happened, sometime in the middle of everything. The child had its face turned outward now, looking at things with the wide, guileless gaze that very young children of any species seem to have. Large eyes, taking in the lights and colors and sounds of the market with something that looked very much like wonder. "Your name," the woman said. "Marcus," I said. She said her own name. I won't try to render the pronunciation in text. It's Marin, and Marin names have sounds that don't map cleanly to written standard. But she told me, clearly, the way you tell someone your name when you've decided they've earned it. She looked down at her child, then back at me. "She is called Seven," she said, the child's name rendered in standard because the Marin version was similar. "She is 8 months." I looked at Seven. Seven looked back at me with those enormous amber eyes, her mother's eyes in miniature, full of the uncomplicated alertness of infancy. "She's beautiful," I said. The mother, I'm going to call her Asha, because that's the closest standard rendering of her name, looked at me with an expression that finally I could fully read. It was gratitude, but it was also something else, something harder to name. The expression of someone who has been in a situation that required them to have very low expectations of the world, and then encountered something that exceeded those expectations, and doesn't quite know what to do with that yet. I was late to my shift by 11 minutes. My supervisor, a Keth woman named Dreveth who is exceptionally competent and has no patience for lateness, was standing at the entrance to cargo management when I arrived. I explained briefly what had happened. Dreveth looked at me for a moment with those flat, unreadable Keth eyes. Then she said, "You're not late. You're 11 minutes early for your extended shift." She turned and walked back into the office. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and then I followed her. What happened after that morning took a few weeks to unfold. I want to be honest, it wasn't a neat resolution. Life on stations, life in the displacement system, life in the interstices between galactic policy and individual human experience, or individual experience, regardless of species, doesn't resolve neatly. Things happened in pieces over time in the way that real changes tend to happen. The first piece, Korveth. The morning after the incident, Korveth put a sign in his stall window. Small, handwritten, he has a habit of handwriting things which I always found slightly anachronistic given that we're on a space station, but that's Korveth. The sign said in standard, "Any customer who is short today, ask me. We'll work it out." He told me, when I asked him about it later, that he'd been thinking about putting it up for a while. The incident just made him do it sooner. I noticed over the following weeks that there were often 1 or 2 individuals in the early morning, various species, various states of dress and obvious resource status, who spent a moment at his stall window, read the sign, and then approached. Korveth always stepped aside from his other customers and had a quiet conversation with them. I never heard what was said, but I never saw anyone walk away from those conversations empty-handed. The second piece, the enforcement officer. The human officer, I learned her name was Sergeant Raina Torres, 12-year gas veteran, stationed at Velaryon for the past 4 years, had done something after leaving the market that morning that I only found out about much later. She'd looked up Asha's file in the assembly system. Asha was in her 3rd year of the displacement processing queue. Her application for provisional transit residency, which would give her legal status at Velaryon, and a work permit, had been flagged for a documentation gap. Her original housing unit records from the Marin system had been lost in the same extraction treaty administrative chaos that had displaced her people to begin with. Without those records, her application was stuck. Torres had spent about 2 weeks navigating the gas bureaucratic system, which is, by all accounts, extraordinarily tedious and complex, to find a workaround. There was a provision for documented cases where original records had been lost due to assembly administrative action. It required a senior enforcement officer's verification. Torres filed it. She didn't tell HFY she was doing this. She didn't tell me. I found out from Drevath, who found out from a friend in station administration several weeks later. HFY's provisional residency approval came through on a Wednesday morning, about 6 weeks after the market incident. I know this because I happened to be walking through Section 7 when it happened. HFY was standing near the administration kiosk in the central corridor, holding 7, looking at a document on the kiosk screen. And the expression on her face when she read it was the kind of expression that you're not supposed to see on strangers. It was too private, too enormous. The expression of someone who has been waiting for something so long that, when it arrives, the body doesn't quite know how to hold it. I kept walking. She deserved that moment without an audience. The third piece, this one is smaller, but I keep coming back to it. About 3 weeks after the market incident, I was in Section 7 on my morning walk, Corvath stall, the usual line. And I noticed a sound that was different, a higher sound, a voice I didn't immediately place. I slowed down. Behind Corvath's counter, in the small prep area visible through the gap in the stall's back wall, someone was helping. A Marin woman, tall, faded gray-green outer garment, moving with the quick, efficient movements of someone learning a task and taking it seriously. She was carrying a tray of loaves from the proofing rack to the display area. Corvath was showing her something, the order system, I think, the tablet he uses for tracking, pointing at it, explaining. She was nodding, watching, paying close attention. 7 was in a carrier on her back. The child was awake, looking out at everything with those wide amber eyes, entirely comfortable. I watched for a moment. Corvath saw me watching and gave me the kind of nod that means mind your business, but warmly. I nodded back and kept walking. I've been thinking about that morning a lot lately. Not because anything about it was extraordinary in the galactic sense. There were no great battles, no political shifts, no species-defining moments that would end up in the historical record. It was a woman who was hungry, stealing a small piece of bread to feed her child. It was a vendor who decided that his inventory count had simply been off. It was an enforcement officer who bought a loaf of bread instead of making an arrest, and then spent 2 weeks filing paperwork she wasn't required to file. It was Drevath, giving me 11 minutes I didn't deserve and pretending otherwise. None of it was required. That's the part that keeps coming back to me. Nobody was forced to act the way they acted. Corvath wasn't required to cover for a theft. Torres wasn't required to navigate 6 weeks of bureaucratic process for someone she didn't know. Drevath wasn't required to be kind about 11 minutes. I wasn't required to step between an enforcement officer and the person they were there to detain. The Galactic Assembly, in its official communications, talks a lot about what it calls sapient solidarity, the idea that all thinking beings have rights, that the system is designed to support and protect the most vulnerable. That's the official framework. That's what the documents say. But what happened in Section 7 that morning wasn't the official framework. The official framework would have had HFY detained, processed, returned to the queue from a different position. The official framework was already in motion. The enforcement officers were already on their way. What stopped it wasn't policy. It was Corvath and his inventory count. It was Torres and a loaf of bread she bought for no particular reason. It was a Keth supervisor who adjusted a clock. It was small, individual, unspectacular choices made by ordinary people who just decided in the moment to be a certain kind of person. I think about 7 sometimes. She'll be about 2 years old now by my best estimate. Old enough to be starting to move around on her own, to be starting to understand language, to be starting to form the early impressions that become, over decades, a sense of what the world is like, what people are like, what can be expected and what can't. She won't remember that morning. She was 8 months old and she was hungry and then she wasn't, and that's all she knew. But her mother will remember it, and what her mother remembers will shape, in 1,000 ways too small to trace, what 7 comes to believe about the universe she's growing up in. I hope what she comes to believe is something true. I've worked in space for going on 15 years. Cargo management, transit coordination, supply logistics, the unglamorous infrastructure of a galactic civilization. I've seen the big machinery of it, the trade agreements, the fleet movements, the assembly sessions, the policy shifts. All the enormous, official, important things that shape life at a civilizational scale. And none of it, has stayed with me the way one small stolen loaf of bread did. Not because of the theft, because of what came after it. Because of Corvath's hands filling a bag without being asked. Because of Tor's buying bread she probably didn't want. Because of a Shaz's face at an administration kiosk on a Wednesday morning, reading a document that told her she was allowed to stay. Because of 7's eyes, wide and amber and completely, unreservedly open, looking out at a space station that could have been hostile and wasn't. We talk about humanity like it's a species, like it's biological, like it's a category you either belong to or you don't. But I've seen it in a Russian-Ukrainian man's bread stall at 7 in the morning. I've seen it in a veteran enforcement officer's paperwork. I've seen it in a Keth supervisor's adjusted time log. I've seen it, most of all, in the face of a Marin mother who, when I told her I wasn't going to say anything, looked at her child before she looked at me. I don't know what to call that. I don't know if there's a word for it. But I know what it looks like. And I think that's enough to go on.